Hi, everyone. Hi, good to see you. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks to the Simpson Center for making this possible, and with colleagues in the audience who are part of these clusters. This has been really fun to plan. To start with, today we're exploring the value of archival theory as a means of grappling with bias in algorithmic system design, and particularly this reframing of bias as absence. And this is, just for some context, is kind of a long-standing project that's been going on for over a year now, discussions among us in a group, and then a kind of cadence that allowed for time to percolate and think about some of the ideas that developed into an essay that this panel is actually based on. So I'll get into some of the specifics here just as an introduction, but wanted to give that brief context and also acknowledge together the land that we're working on here as the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people connected to the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I want to begin this introduction by way of also recognizing Romi Morrison's contributions here. They were unable to join us, very sadly, because of a family emergency. So it's on theme in the sense of absence. They've been a real powerful presence in this work, and we are going to be invoking them throughout. This is also a kind of call to look into their work after the panel and engage with them later. But now I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists, both from the city of Atlanta, Georgia. So Jihan Sherman is an architect, designer, and artist, a storyteller, a creative maker, curious questioning and learning, a very interesting project called Estelle in Boots, which is a creative practice that she's developed that engages design, in particular through storytelling, placemaking, and the power of mindful everyday encounters. Lauren Klein is a Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the Department of Quantitative, that was a hard one for me, Quantitative Theory and Methods at English at Emory University, where she's also directing the Digital Humanities Lab. She's working at the intersection of data science, AI, and humanities with an emphasis on questions of gender and race. And what's exciting is, so she is an author of several books, an archive of taste and data feminism, which was named a must-read book for spring 2020, I think, by Wired. But also that the book that she's developing is actually in progress and going to be part of a workshop tomorrow. So please join us for the afternoon. And I should say Jihan has a workshop following as well that's connected to your project. So we hope you'll be there. So I sort of developing out into the panel, we want to acknowledge how this issue, just for sort of an introduction to algorithmic bias, has really entered this mainstream conversation around these uneven effects, right, of algorithmic systems that are driving automation, digitization of industries, often reproducing social hierarchies marked by race, class, disability, sexuality, gender, other categories of difference. And these are concerns that are coming from advocacy efforts of several groups like the Algorithmic Justice League, investigative reporting by organizations like ProPublica, as well as much of the academic research of scholars in the room, Anna Lauren Hoffman in particular, folks like Sophia Noble, Benjamin, Meredith Brizard, so among many others. We're also really interested in how regulation, right, by the European Union and more recently the White House, right, has played into this. So these are projects that are really importantly informing us around how the source of algorithmic bias is not any particular data set or model. Instead, it's the structural power differentials that produce social inequity. So these are like legacies of capital and colonial power. And with this panel, we're now looking at what additional work is required, right? If we're able to intervene into the issues of bias at its source, then the source of algorithmic bias, it may not be any particular data set, right? It's not the model, instead it's those differentials. Then the issue lies in the relationships to historical data, to the lives, to the worlds that are left undocumented, unsaid, and untold. So with this, we find this capacity to imagine the omission, which is the absence, otherwise. We're turning to now Lauren and Jihan, who are examining this idea of absence as it's been theorized through the field of archival studies and later through design speculations. So we're going to begin now with a genealogy of absence. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can people in the back hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Well, first of all, I just wanted to start by saying thank you. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone here. Every time people show up to a thing in person with their real bodies post-pandemic, I recognize that as a thing not to be taken for granted. And I really appreciate your holding the space physically, in addition to what we are going to be talking about in our panel today, for your presence. Thanks also to Daniela, really, who has been the motivating force in keeping this project going and bringing us here. And it's really meaningful. Jihan and I last saw each other, what, 8 years ago in person or something like that. And so it's really meaningful for even just not all of us, but some of our paper team to be together in person. Thanks to Caitlin and Megan. Really, it's not always that you can get off an airplane and Zoom right up into your hotel, into the place, and everything is working, and it's working. So, well, I'm not going to jinx it, but thank you for all of your coordination. So as Daniela mentioned, what I'm going to do today is try to give you a little bit of a background, a genealogy, if you will, about the ways in which we understand absence, the scholars that we're drawing on, and I'm going to start to try to plant the seeds of the connections that Jihan is going to really take up in the second part of this talk that involve, wait, I've mixed my metaphors here. You can't link seeds to whatever, whatever. That essentially trying to connect archival theory to some of these phenomena with respect to data bias and other algorithmic harms that we're experiencing in the world today. So you'll notice some contemporary examples dropped into some of the theory. So generally speaking, absence just refers to a lack, like a thing that isn't there. But in the realm of archival theory, and particularly theories that emerge from the archive of slavery, there is a really rich body of work that's theorized absence as a presence instead. And some of that work you can see here. And what I'm going to do, like I just mentioned, is during my time is just sort of pull out some of the key contributions of this work and begin to connect them to these questions of data bias and algorithmic harm. And just a quick aside, but I think it's important to answer out loud the question of sort of what brings me as a white person to this work. I was originally trained as a scholar of early American literature. And through my own work and through my study, I came to realize that the history of the United States, was the history of colonialism and slavery. And these particular theories of the archive and the archive of slavery in particular were really those that helped me sort of be able to see a path forward in my own work. And so they really hold an important place for me in my own intellectual genealogy. And it's actually this question of sort of how we move forward that connects the work that we'll be presenting today. Because one of the key observations that brought our group together in the first place was about how the discourse around bias and AI and bias in data, like it seems stuck, right? Especially in technical fields. For the past several years, there's been growing consensus about the fact that data sets and the systems they drive are biased, right? But there were and are, this is being recorded. There were very few examples just beyond like documenting that bias about how to move forward in light of the fact that we will always be dealing with, in effect, biased data. And it struck us that a lot of these theories of the archive, and particularly those having to do with the archive of slavery, could have a lot to teach folks in technical fields because, as Daniela mentioned, they point us to the social, historical, and political conditions that give rise to archives, which are biased. And also to these spaces of indeterminacy that they encompass, as well as also these sort of irrecoverably missing parts. And we thought that attempting to translate, and I sort of use that word with an asterisk, and we can talk a little bit about this later on, but I'm just going to racket it right now. We thought that translating some of this theory into the space of data and algorithms would illustrate, first of all, the importance of understanding all data sets and data systems as sort of permanently embedded in structures of power, rather than viewing them as these binary systems in and of themselves, like either it's biased or it's not. And we also thought that framing bias as this richer idea of absence would open up questions of both collective responsibility and also personal commitment, including questions about the responsibility that each of us has as a researcher working with a particular data set, our individual as well as collective commitments to pursuing knowledge in that space. We thought it would sort of prompt needed conversation about these broader questions that we sort of hadn't yet seen being asked. So to sort of get started, what you see here is a very famous quote by the Haitian anthropologist and historiographic theorist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. This comes from his book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, which was one of the titles that I had up on the previous slide. And here he's talking about how our understanding of the past is produced. And he identifies what he calls silences or sort of gaps in the archive and how they enter into our understanding of history in 4 ways. So he says here, the moment of fact creation, by which he means the making of sources, the moment of fact assembly or the making of archives, the moment of fact retrieval, or the making of narratives, and then the moment of retrospective significance, or the making of history in the final instance. So these are moments in the literary critical sense. They're not actually discrete moments in time. They're better understood as 4 intersecting ways that structures of power influence how we in the present know what we know. So Trouillot's focus in his book is the Haitian Revolution. So when he's talking about the process of making sources, this is bound up in colonial power relations between the French citizens, the colonists who can make the sources, and the Haitian subjects who cannot. So in other words, colonial governments produce documents about colonial subjects. They have the institutional, educational, and physical apparatus that enables them to create records of their lives. And the colonized subject, again, this is a binary week of trouble, but that's roughly what we're talking about. So in a Haitian context, these are also racial power relations, right? Because of the dominant identities of each group. And so this is how forces of power begin to shape the production of documents, and as we will soon see, also data. Even before the desire to create an archive or a data set even takes place. So this is sort of preceding the moment of the archival creation or the data set. So in order to talk about the second moment when power shapes the production of knowledge, so this is the moment of making archives, I want to turn to a contemporary archive, which is also a data set, which is C4, the Colossal Clean Common Crawl Corpus, which is one of the major data sets they use to train large language models, which power ChatGPT. I feel like I'm speaking to audiences with different expertise, but I'm going to try to define my terms here. So if you're not familiar with this data set, it contains mostly text that's been scraped from the web. And it's also it's notoriously not well documented, but from what people know about it, one of the big chunks of it is all of Wikipedia. And so thinking back to that first moment of fact creation that Trouillot identifies, sort of before the data set is even made, we can just think about what we know about Wikipedia, right? It's 90% of Wikipedia authors are men. Most of them are in the 18 to 29-year-old age demographic. Most of them are located in the United States, writing in English. And so the absence of both sources about everyone else in the world, as well as sources written by everyone else in the world, is one of the key reasons for the biases of these large language models, which at this point are very, very well known. But what I want to talk about with this example is actually that second moment, the making of archives. And thanks to the work of Emily Bender and Angie McMillan-Major here at UW, and Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, we know even more about these so-called quality filters that are applied to this data set, to quote Klein it, which they do, for example, by removing any document that has reference to the word queer in it, because it's deemed to be a bad word. So this means on top of the fact that queer people are underrepresented as authors and subjects in the data set, as a whole, there's these additional silences or absences that get layered in, right? So even more documents about queer people, including those that celebrate queer communities and cultures, they're excluded from this data set, this sort of web archive. And then very briefly, also up on the slide, you see work by Sachin Garagnathan about how additional socioeconomic biases impact these quality filters, work by Lucy Lee about multilingual bias, as well as specific social identities and occupations that are filtered out. Again, just because of the way that these filters, because of the way that people designing these filters have determined to define sort of what is worth being included and what is not. So as for the third and fourth moments when power shapes knowledge, so this is the making of narratives, the stories that we tell, and the moment of making retrospective significance. So this is sort of like how we understand history to have happened. These layers of power just continue to compound. So here you see an example of a project drawn from Rita Quadri and Fuchsia Hart and a couple of other people about Islamic art and text-to-image models. And so they show how, in spite of the wide variety of actual Islamic art in the world, the images created with these text-to-image models are prompted to produce examples of Islamic art that are very, very narrow. And this is actually comes back to real colonialism. I guess I shouldn't say real, sort of original forms of colonialism, because colonialism remains real. But there's a couple of layers here, right? So the first, the fact that colonial powers decided, in the 18th, 19th century and even earlier, which original artifacts they liked and therefore should preserve and which they shouldn't. So this is the making of archives. But then these original artifacts then get digitized or represented in digital form and put online by institutions like the British Museum, which is itself a colonial institution. This becomes then also a shaper of narratives, right? So how do you learn about what, for example, Islamic art encompasses or what it should look like? Well, you would go to a museum where a curatorial team has set out certain images that reflect the story that they want to tell. And then you take these digitized images and feed them all into a model asked to produce images of Islamic art. And these silences, again, compound. You get limited examples with the colonial viewpoint embedded inside that confirm this very narrow view of what matters in the world about sort of what Islamic art is and what is not. So like the example of texts about queer communities being excluded from large language models, or texts written from the perspective of Haitian revolutionaries being excluded from these colonial archives, these are all examples of absences in the archives. And all of them are examples that, like, once downstream, sort of once you've left that moment, those moments of historical production, they're very difficult to ever simply fix, right? So this is really where we saw the original intervention of our project, which is that by becoming more attuned to which stories the archive makes possible and which stories the archive can't tell, we start to be able to move more intentionally through it. So making decisions to focus on stories we'd like to amplify, and also becoming aware of the limits of being able to tell certain stories as well. And so broadly speaking, this is what's gained by understanding absence in terms of power. And I should have backed up and said there are sort of three ways in which we present absence in this paper. And the first one of them, as you've just heard, is power. So I'm going to move on to the sort of second way of understanding absence, which is as presence. And this is sort of a more recent contribution to conversations in archival theory. And there's a whole range of contemporary scholars who have taken up the issue of absences in the archive, who show us with a range of applications how we might reconceive absences as presence in and of themselves. And in our paper, we draw from the example of the null value, which has been theorized in media studies by Jacob Gabory and extended back to apply to the archive of slavery by Jessica Marie Johnson. So Jacob's original paper explores the idea of the null value in relational databases, actually in terms of structural queerness. And so in his formulation, this idea of holding space or memory for a value, even if you don't know or don't yet know what that value will be, is a lot like structural queerness. So this sort of rejection of all existing possible categories or values while still insisting that space be held open. And so what Johnson does is take Gabory's idea and bring it back to the archive of slavery. So her research involves looking closely. So this book, Wicked Flesh, is about the role of Black women in New Orleans primarily, but as they're connected to a broader, sort of like the broader Atlantic world in the mostly late 16th, 17th into the 18th centuries. And she's particularly interested in expressions of agency, pleasure, sexuality that sort of push back against the sort of top-down view that, or the sort of the dominant narrative that we get of sort of a one-sided retelling of sexuality in the sort of condition of enslavement. And what her research involves in order to make this case is looking really, really closely at shipping logs and ledger books, which end up being one of the largest primary records that tell us about these women's lives. And she looks at them both in the original, so handwritten ledger books, but also as they've been digitized in online databases. And what she finds are a lot of what we would call in the contemporary moment, like inconsistent entries. A lot of these entries are incomplete. And many of the entries that are incomplete, meaning that they have less information about the people recorded than others, are ones that have to do with women and girls, about whom fewer identifying details are recorded than the men who were enslaved. And she uses the idea of the null value to suggest that we hold space to recognize the fact and significance of these women's lives. Even if we lack the evidence, we can never get sort of concrete evidence that we might hope for that would actually tell us how individual people led their individual lives. And so one of the sort of leading figures in the space who Johnson is drawing from is Saidiya Hartman, whose importance in this discussion is really like impossible to overstate. The only reason why we didn't lead with her is just in the narrative sequence. That's how it worked out. But her thinking over 20 years pretty much is structuring this whole field. She's also a scholar of slavery, and her early work was really like field altering in terms of how it drew our attention to the harms of restaging the originary violence that we were researching, even as the goal might be to better understand it, to try to sort of probe its significance in the present. And her main question, which you can see, I mean, you can read all of her work. This, if you want an encapsulation, this essay is particularly, it's a good connection point between some of her early work and some of her later work. But her main question was that, you know, given the sort of the tremendous violence that the Archive of Slavery documents, the sort of inescapable fact, first of all, and secondly, if so, how can you use the same archive, this archive that really does just document violence, can you use it to tell a different story? And for a long time, the answer was like, I'm not sure. I don't think so. We might just need to leave it. But over the course of her own career, she began to develop techniques in her own scholarship that she modeled, but also theorized about, including this idea of critical fabulation, which I think is familiar to many of you here. Both Daniela and Jihan have explored this in their work. And it's also what takes us to this sort of third idea that we connect to absence, which is absence as productive, which we wanted to call generative, but now that there's Gen AI, it got confusing. And so the production, it actually is like a valenceless productive. It's just a word that's not generative. We envision it really just as a way of working with absence, not as a quantifier of facticity or of truth, but instead just as a prompt to tell a different story. And so this involves slower work. It involves the work of care, considering your own responsibility and your own relationship to that absence, which may not be the same as others, and inviting additional possible reference. So you can see Hartman's own formulation of this method here, which she describes as, quote, playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story and representing or representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view. Elsewhere in this essay, she sums this up as, quote, history written with and against the archive. And so, this whole book is where Hartman really puts her own method on display, but I actually want to illustrate it with a final example that will take me to Jihan's portion of the talk, which is from one of Hartman's interlocutors, Taya Miles. So what you're looking at here on the left is is an artifact called Ashley's sack. It was actually recently only just sort of rediscovered at a secondhand fabric store by a person who recognized its potential significance and brought it to the attention of archivists and historians, including Miles. And then in this book from which this quote is drawn, Miles elaborates these. This is embroidery, it's only 10 lines. She elaborates this into this incredibly rich multi-generational story about family, about connection, about survival in the wake of slavery, as well as the practices of love and care that connect these three Black women to a very particular place and time. So this work is crucially structured through archival research. There's a lot of facts that are brought in and other accounts that are brought in to amplify the significance of these 10 lines here. But very crucially, it's also speculative. And so this is where I sort of want to begin to bring us to Jihan's portion of the talk. So in the case of the story that Miles tells about Ashley's sack, like I said before, the speculation is based on meticulous historical research and engagement with the fragments that the archive does contain, but it also pushes against the limits of them, as well as the narratives that have been constructed using those fragments up to this point. So just to put it another way, it identifies absence not as simply a gap that needs to be filled, but as an opportunity to speculate about a story that is representative of and therefore situated in a broader collective experience. So Miles' story, it's not a corrective. She ends up never really being able to tell us exactly who these people were and exactly what these words mean, and even exactly what was in the sack. But what the story represents is a repositioning. So it's a shift in perspective of Rose and Ashley and Ruth, the women named, the women who are named and connected back to this sack. So in other words, it can't give voice to them. We don't know what they said beyond these words, but it holds space for their voices. And in doing so, it offers an example both of, what can be counted as archival material, right? Which we also might extend to data, so expanding our definition of what counts. And it also very crucially highlights the possibilities of speculating within this space of absence. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jihan to give you some examples of what this looks like. I was just using both arrow keys.
Okay, perfect. Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. I'm Jihan Sherman, and I'm going to kind of continue this conversation through a series of projects that we've been discussing in relation to absence in and as design speculation. So I think TML's work with Ashley Sack and Hartman's foundations with the work with critical fabulations is kind of a strong launching point for our thinking about where projects that are helping us think about these relationships between power and presence and the productive nature of absence in this work. Okay. So to begin, I want to kind of clarify. Okay, all right. To begin, I want to clarify what we mean when we say design speculation. So in our usage in this context, we refer to it as a specific tradition of speculating into what might have happened in the past in ways that draw a link to redressing bias in the present and the future. So our thinking here is focused on projects that materialize and complicate one or more of the three dimensions of absence we've been discussing so far: power, presence, and productive. So within this context, speculation works as both exploratory and experimental. So it's situated in and occurring in relation to a very specific archive or data set in which it's engaging. And so that's an important kind of quality in terms of how we're thinking about design speculation and the projects that we begin to focus on to surface these relationships and dynamics relative to absence. This is also a distinguishing quality of how we're thinking about these design speculations from other traditions of speculative design, for example, or design fiction that have occupied the design space or the speculative space as we think about technology studies. These traditions, speculative design and design fiction, have often focused on a futuring activity, and they position the designer or author as a driver of that activity, right? So the speculations that we've been interested in focus instead on how to trouble the authority of the archival and data-driven systems they engage. And that troubling is where we see some of the real opportunities in thinking about absence and how it sort of becomes this generative, productive mode of engagement. So we'll talk about 4 projects, and I'll talk about them very briefly. So I sort of just scratched the surface in a lot of ways, but I'll begin to kind of reveal some of the relationships that we are starting to identify as important to the notion of design speculation as a method for further settling into this space of absence as a place of complexity, a place of struggle, a place of staying with the trouble, and also a place of generating important imaginative ideas about archives and data sets in their own right, but also how we engage them and how we think about the design outcomes and products that we generate from them. So there are 2 themes that organize those 4 projects. The first is focused on AI-based language translation, and the other on quilts. So our aim was to examine 2 distinctly different relationships to algorithmic design. And with each of the thematic pairings, we put these kind of imaginative reworkings of algorithmic bias in dialogue with these critical archival concepts that Lauren has been discussing so far. So we'll start first with the theme of the AI language translation. And so the first example we sort of looked at is translation work from design researcher Lacey Jacoby, who reimagined Google Translate to reveal these linguistic cultural bias that are often embedded within the tool. And so Lacey begins, welcome to a new translation experience. And that's what comes up as the app initiates. There's a drop-down menu that offers sample phrases for translation from English to Korean. You select a phrase, for example, do you like that guy? The prompt then displays the Korean translation, but there's a conjoining pop-up that also identifies the embedded assumptions within that translation. So, for example, this pop-up will particularly identify an assumption or bias built into Google Translate's algorithm related to decisions about gender and sexuality, for example, relative to the do you like that guy question. So rather than change the answer or the algorithm that produced it, Jacoby makes the hidden interpretation visible through the pop-up mechanism, right? So this is an important distinction in how the speculation occurs, right? So within the experiment, Jacobi exposes those assumptions about gender and sexuality within the algorithmic model, but also aspects of the data set that don't exist. So for example, based on the answer that Google Translate gives, the tool likely did not train on algorithmic models of data where males were asking other males, for example. So through the pop-up, the absence of this data activates the acknowledgement of its loss. From the perspective of the designer, the data absence works as power, revealing a gendered and heterosexual tendencies embedded in the tool. But from the perspective of a user, the absence also works as presence, pushing back against notions of correction, which can often obscure the problem that's actually at hand. So next we'll put Jacobi's provocation and conversation with the poetic experimentation of interdisciplinary writer, artist, and performer, Bettina Judd. So we'll look specifically at her work with glossolalia, an engagement with poet Lucille Clifton's process of automatic or spirit writing. So it's a form of linguistic composition without conscious intention. So Judd considers this process of spirit writing an exploration, in her words, of the space between knowing and unknowing. So with this project, glossolalia, which she terms an experiment in speaking in tongues, she approaches Google Translate. So we're circling back around to Google Translate as an interesting tool to surface these relationships. So there's several phases to her process. So first she speaks in tongues, then she transcribes that speaking, and then she runs that transcript through Google Translate, which automatically detects it as Swahili. Then she runs the output through the translation of multiple additional languages, for example, Catalan, Basque, Azerbaijani, and then she runs a translation back to English. And from these outputs, she composes poetry. So Judd's stage poetry performance, in Judd's stage poetry performance, the absence of linguistic recognition by the translation algorithm, it poses the impossibility of knowing, right? As a contemplation of knowing, the absence becomes productive. It supports Judd's poetic response to Clifton's method, but also this kind of space of absence embedded within the tool. Okay. So I'll move relatively quickly to our second theme, where we began to explore quilts as design speculations. So quilts are less often approached as computational artifacts composed of data. And so by considering them in conjunction with an AI language translation systems, we're inviting a more expansive reading of the data set and re-examining the material and compositional boundaries of algorithmic design. So I'll kind of talk a little bit more on the particular quilt projects that we have been focusing on. And so I do want to call attention to, I am particularly invoking Romi Morrison and their work with quilts, particularly the freedom quilts, in the conversation here, and connecting it to work that I've been doing with African-American craftswomen over the last 6 years or so. And so I just wanted Romi's presence to be articulated in this moment. So we'll start with, okay, sorry, it's a little bit of a choreography. So we'll start with these quilts. And I just want to point attention to a couple of things, right? Because this will kind of lead the conversation. So this first corner, a representation of the freedom quilts that I'll start with discussion. In the middle is an example of some of the quilts from G's bin, and I'll talk a little bit more of that. And it's really a bridge between the second example that I'll discuss, which is Curry Hackett's AI realized quilted designs that utilize inspiration in some of the imagery from the actual G's bin's quilts. All right, so we focus specifically on the freedom quilts as a covert system of encodings that charted escape routes for enslaved Black people. These freedom quilts are a vital form of computation that forces us to rethink what computing can be when freed from its dependence on colonial pursuits of managing bodies, spaces, and resources. Though we embrace the freedom quilts as a Black and diasporic form of computing, they also live in tension, burdened by taxonomic logics that demand evidence and proof. This contested history of the freedom quilts challenges the distinction between absence and legibility. turning our attention to the use of protocols that cannot be transparent, but must circulate through opacity and the embedded trust of interdependence. So here we can think back to Lauren's conversation about that thing that is impossible to know, that thing that wasn't captured, that data that isn't available, right? And how do we begin to think about what's happening inside that null value, what's happening inside that space of absence? So the absence of definitive proof of the quilting patterns, the protocols for their assemblage, the exact location and indexing of use. These details, they distract from the provocation that they offer our current inquiry on absence. Instead, the Freedom Quilts thrive as a clandestine network of information sharing because they are rendered absent within the imagination of the plantation system that is obsessed with endless pursuits of measurement, hierarchy, logistics, and analytics. So it begins to trouble those very notions, right? Our very notions of what computing is, how networks of information sharing work. So within the Freedom Quilts, the nature of code is being written through the creolization of symbols, meanings, contexts, and codes that change and shift in accordance with different sites and ensembles. This complicates our familiarity with programming as a temporality of code, as executable function, as cause and effect, right? So this is where we start to see really kind of the power of occupying the space of absence and an example of how we really begin to move from the sort of fix-it logics that tend to be coupled with previous notions of bias, right? This absence then becomes this destabilizing, troubling thing that we can settle into, right? So this non-totalizing, concept of computation that we've been discussing with the Freedom Quilts, it opens important lines of interpretation for the work of architect Curry Hackett, our fourth design speculation. So we turn to Hackett's series of generative AI photorealistic worlds inspired by the quilts from G's bin. From the set of intricately assembled asymmetrical improvisational patterns designed by Black artisans from this small isolated Alabama town, Hackett imagined cities of the future. So using the quilt to rethink architectural space, Hackett's imagery complicates what counts as ordered and spatially secure. The soft tapestries atop towering skyscrapers challenges stereotypical generative AI outputs for the city of the future prompt. Here on the left, we have Manas Bahati's AI-created tower, which looks very familiar to the kinds of AI-generated concepts of the future that we've been seeing. And on the other side, we see one of Hackett's AI-realized quilted cities, right? So Hackett's image shifts us away from landscape depictions with these, technological chrome, often white pedestrians. And it also recenters Black cultural production, as he describes. I would love for someone to hang a bunch of quilts in the woods and get married under there. I see this work as an open source repository for free ideas for how to imagine a world that centers Blackness, Black culture, Black aesthetics, Black modes of living. Like the Freedom Quilts, the quilted skyscraper does more than expose the absence of power or even presence. It also helps broaden the normative aesthetics of pattern. Like the maintenance of the Freedom Quilts, the G's Ben's aesthetics and Hackett's renderings evoke a powerful call to improvisation and contingency. In this aesthetic ordering contingency, the interdependence of elements becomes the recursive practice for computing. So from these four design speculations that we've talked about, very briefly, like we've only scratched the surface here on the richness of these projects. The first, Lacey Jacoby's AI translation project. Second, Bettina Judd's Glossolalia project. And then the two quilting projects, Encoding in the Freedom Quilts and Curry Hackett's reimagining of the G's Bin quilters. We begin to see a concern for how power, presence, and productiveness work as de facto sites for meaning making. The translation app and the quilt both offer spaces for rereading dataset silences as invitations for alternative modes of engagement. For example, We might think about intimate listening to the contours of entrenched gender norms, attunement to formats for decoding and realigning pattern, resurrection of connections to the inner self. It is inside the null value that we find new and different value by allowing something unexpected and generous to escape. We also find that with the shift toward absence, the design speculations operate between traces and fragments that have been captured. And this is, I think, a really important distinction about how we've been thinking about these design speculations and the opportunity in shifting toward these notions of absence. And when we look at the work of Saidiya Hartman and Tia Mills and Trullo, all of these scholars we've been, using as foundations for our thinking here, right? This connection to these fragments and these traces and these documentations, the things that have been captured, I think is actually a really important one, and is what kind of distinguishes this against these other kinds of modes of speculation, right? And that may lean more toward fictions or fantasies, right? They help us consider what might have happened where the record is incomplete, compromised, or inaccurate. But they also challenge a linear reading of speculative time, one narrowly focused on the past conceived as a point that has already occurred and ended. To this reorientation, they frame the past as entangled with the present realities and future possibilities. They reveal an intermingling that troubles distinctions of history and future. So it's at the seams of this reimagining that we look to absence as absence. A breaking apart of absence into absence foregrounds the prefix abs, meaning away or from, alongside the sense of embodied perception. To work from embodied perception is to recognize the always implicated and implicating stance of the viewer analyst, and the need to reckon with objectivity and force distance with data. In this intimate relation, absence invites an attunement to bodies in motion, to encounters that begin from the sensory and a particular bodily knowing. It reveals experiences encoded in archives, databases, or technologies as always tied to lives marked by ideology. Okay. So across our investigations of absence, we see how the concept becomes one, an indicator of power with which analysts can carefully work through what is not there, an activation of presence that allows analysts to wrestle with what gets hidden, excluded, or left incomplete as a lively contributor to meaning making, and a capacious idea of the productive, which opens analysis to imagining the world differently. Together, these three dimensions of absence prompt us as analysts to consider the nature of the agreements and conditions we need to do our work with intention, accountability, and care. They draw attention to the social relationships around knowledge produced through and with algorithmic design. And with that, I think we're gonna move on to some discussion.